Hebrews chapter 12. So we're slowly making our way through, but like we said 2 weeks ago, and it's been 2 weeks, so we're going to back up just a little bit, kind of put some pieces together instead of just jumping in where we left off. Hebrews chapter 12 is pulling in all of the themes from Hebrews and tying them together. It's tying them together with application statements. And 13 is going to get very, very specific with the applications and how we're to apply them. But for right now in chapter 12, at the beginning of this, he's pulling in all of these different themes we've looked at and showing us how everything fits together. And so beginning in verse 4, where we were last week, he begins to take the family relationship, the theme of family, and as well as the theme of suffering. And he begins to tie them together to show why. And the suffering he's talking about is very, very specific. It's not just any suffering. It's not suffering because of bad decisions that we have made or someone else has made, because we do suffer from those kind of things. It's suffering specifically because of our allegiance to Jesus, because of our relationship in his family. And it goes back and mirrors what Jesus himself would say in the Beatitudes: blessed are you when you are persecuted for my sake. It's very specific there. And so this is a specific suffering. And what we're going to see, or what we saw 2 weeks ago in this paragraph from 4 to about 12 is that paragraph markings. What we saw is that this suffering is used by God to discipline us. And that discipline becomes very, very important because it shows us basically three aspects or three benefits. And we pointed these out, but again, it's critical to kind of look at this, to kind of remind ourselves of this because of the time we've been away from it, but also because the next paragraph is going to show what our response to the discipline should be. And that's where we are tonight. And so they're really interconnected. But the first thing in regard to this discipline is God disciplines us. It shows a relationship. It reveals the relationship that we have with God. We are the sons of God through Jesus. And if we were not sons, then he wouldn't discipline. Has anybody ever disciplined a child in Walmart that wasn't theirs? Probably not. I tell a story of my boss back in Pensacola. He had a young son. He was probably about 7 or 8 years old at the time, and they're at the mall. He and his wife are at the mall. And he sees his son just sitting on a bench, and they were ready to go. And so he starts yelling at him. He says, "Come on, Brantley, let's go." And his son just sits there, back to him, completely ignoring him. And he says, "Brantley, come on." And he doesn't move. And so when the final time, Brantley still doesn't move. He goes over there, whaps him on the back of his head. And he turns around, and it's not Brantley. About that time, his wife is standing by the door, and she calls his name, and he turns around, and Brantley's standing right next to her. And he said he never moved so quickly in his life, but this kid's face was just staring at him like, "What did I do?" But that's unusual. We never really discipline a child that's not our own. And the reason we do that because they're not family. And so when we're disciplined by God, it reveals our relationship to him. It reveals we are sons of God. It reveals that we are family. Because discipline is meant to be instructive. We think of discipline as punitive because we've all done wrong things growing up and we suffer the consequences of being grounded or spanked or whatever. But it's really instructive. Even the negative consequence of the action that causes the discipline, it's to make us better people, fit for society, prepare us for eternity. It has all these positive aspects to it. And so discipline, we need to look at it as instructive. Discipline is instructive. So there's a relationship. We're sons. And he is very explicit here. He says if God didn't discipline us or we eschew his discipline, we're illegitimate. We're illegitimate and we don't deserve. Okay. And then the result of discipline. There's a relationship, there's a result. The result of the discipline, it's to make us better. It's to help us mature. It's to strengthen us and give us endurance. The result of discipline, God's discipline, is to make us more godly. And so we have the relationship, we have the result, and then we have the realization. Discipline's painful. None of those spankings were ever pleasant. None of the restrictions were ever pleasant. They're not meant to be. It's painful. Things hurt, but it's ultimately good for us. Verse 11 tells us that it's to help us to produce in us the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And so it's painful, yes, but it helps us to mature. And so those are the three main points in this paragraph that we went over in greater detail 2 weeks ago. And so we're going to pick up in verse 12 and go through 17. And what we see here is our reaction to the discipline. What is our response to be? What is our response to be? And so verse 12 says, "Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears." Okay. So again, we're seeing this idea of discipline and suffering and family. It's coming. The Hebrews author is merging these themes. And we come to this with the realization that even though we're disciplined, even though we endure the discipline, that at the same time we also know that we do not merit or earn our salvation. The suffering isn't the pathway by which we are reconciled with God. How are we reconciled with God? Through Jesus. Through Jesus and his atoning work at the cross, we're reconciled to God. And so this suffering and discipline that we're talking about doesn't reconcile us to God, but it does train us so that we might remain there. And this was very important for this audience. Remember, this audience are Jewish Christians who are being pressured, peer pressure from the culture, even maybe from the authorities that are in charge, from their Jewish families, to leave Jesus and go back to Moses. And some were losing their livelihood. They were extremely suffering because of their relationship with the church, relationship with Jesus. And so this becomes very, very vital for them to understand. They have to understand this. And so we go through the discipline. We have the right view of the discipline. We respond correctly to the discipline, because even though the discipline does not reconcile us to God, it gives us the strength and endurance so that we can remain reconciled with God. We might remain there. It helps us to maintain our holiness so that we might live, as he would say earlier in verse 9. And so with all this in mind, our author tells the audience here to respond, and there's three specific ways. There are three specific ways. First, he tells his audience to stand up. To stand up. Look at verse 12 and 13 again. "Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather healed." Chapter 12 begins with this race metaphor where athletes competing, And we're having to dig deep and endure. Our eyes are to be set on Jesus. He's at the finish line. And so that's where our eyes are. And we're running this race. And we're running. But he's talking to a group, to an audience, who, even though they're still running the race, they're absolutely exhausted. And they're on the verge of just falling. They're on the verge of quitting. And so look at what he tells them. He uses actually 3 pictures here. He uses the picture of feeble arms, of weak knees, of lame feet. All 3 of those phrases are very classical metaphors for exhaustion. They're all just traditional metaphors for exhaustion. And so we could think of it better, more than a runner running. We could think of it as a boxer boxing. I'm not a big sports guy. But I do love my movies. And I always think of Rocky here. That's what I picture. And you know the classical scene, Rocky, man, he's about to quit, right? About midway through the fight, here comes Mr. T. Rocky III's the best one. I don't care what anybody says. Here comes Mr. T, and he's beating him down, and what's his demeanor? He can barely keep his arms up, right? He's swaying, he's losing his balance, his feet aren't working as they should. He's about to lose. He's about to go down. He's exhausted. He's being pummeled in the face. He has all these body blows. It's hard for him to stand up anymore, and he can't even lift his arms to defend himself. And so his hands drop, his knees sag, and just one little uppercut is all it's going to take for him to go down. And so what's his choice? He's got to dig deep. He's got to dig deep and find that endurance. He's got to dig deep to keep fighting. Otherwise, they're going to have to throw in the towel, right? That's the idea here. This isn't just a Hebrews metaphor. This is classical. We can turn back to Isaiah 35. If you want to turn to Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35 has this same image, if you will. Isaiah 35, beginning in verse 3, he says, "Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With the recompense of God, he will come and save you." And so again, it's that same image of one just completely exhausted. In chapter 10 of Hebrews, we looked at several weeks ago, the writer, the speaker, is telling the audience, you stay strong, you endure, because the coming one will come and he will not delay. And that's what Isaiah is saying. Times are tough now, you're exhausted, you're hurting, but don't give up. Don't give up. We as Christians, we live in a perpetual hope of the return of Jesus. That's what keeps us going. Knowing that when he comes back, when we meet him in the air, every wrong is going to be set right. Every wrong is going to be set right. And in the meantime, knowing that, having that hope and that assurance, knowing that, we receive also his help through his high priestly intercession. And we get that from chapter 4. And so again, all of these things are being brought together, being tied together here. And so because we know that, because we know he's with us, he's there for us, he's looking over us providentially, we can hold fast, we can dig deep, we can endure faithfully. And we also see here with all of those things coming together that one of the reasons why we can dig deep and hold fast and endure faithfully is because of the priestly work of Jesus himself. And that gives us that hope. In Proverbs 4 and verse 26, in the Septuagint, these words are actually actually quoted here. He says, make straight paths for your feet. Now, the idea of the drooping hands, the weak knees, that points us to exhaustion. That points us to exhaustion from all of these external trials we're facing and the suffering we're going through. Lame feet is a result from that exhaustion, because lame feet, metaphorically, is pointing towards spiritual lethargy. Just spiritual lethargy. The type that's triggered through temptation and sin. In verse 1, the author calls it, lay aside every weight and every sin that does so easily beset us. He's bringing back that idea. And when we're burdened, it gives us lame feet. That's the idea here. That's the idea. And so he's calling on the audience here to rededicate themselves to the pursuit of holiness. They're supposed to be walking in a straight line. They're supposed to be walking in a straight line, and that means they're going to be living honestly and openly, and they're not going to be inconsistent in their morality or their spirituality. But if they keep on being exhausted, if they don't dig deep to endure, what's going to happen is their lame feet will become a permanent handicap for them. That's going to ultimately lead them into apostasy and to the point of losing their salvation. And so he's encouraging them, you need to straighten up. You need to straighten up. And if you straighten up, verse 13, he says, you'll be healed. And so the first thing, our first response to this discipline is to stand up in verses 12 and 13. The second response is in verse 14, and we're to strive. He says, strive for peace with everyone and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. So we strive for, literally we aspire to. We seek after. It's the idea of pursuing something. In this case, there's two things. We pursue both peace and we pursue holiness. Peace, it's funny that you would mention peace here, because peace seems to always elude us, doesn't it? Peace seems to always be eluding mankind. It's almost like as we go through life, we tend to want to even shun peace. And that seems a weird statement, but if you think about that with me just for a second, and think about how this works, especially with individuals in the world, and unfortunately sometimes even in the church too, who are we told to by culture, let me put it like that, to look after? We're to look out for who? Yourself. You look out for number one, right? Your own interests. You want to get ahead in the world? You stomp on as many people as you can to lift yourself up. That's kind of what we're brought up with. That's what we're trained to do, if you will. We seek our own way. And we're taught that it's our way that's the most important, and everybody else's way is secondary. What everybody else wants is secondary. And yeah, you could yield to it as long as it's not going to affect you. But you look out for number one. Now, is that going to cause peace between individuals if everybody has that mindset? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But that's what we're told, right? Secularly, that's what we're told. That's what we see. That's the example we're given by the world. And so unless we labor for it, it takes exertion. It takes effort on our part. That's why we strive. Even the word strive tells us that there's effort to be involved, right? Strive tells us this is not an easy thing to do. It's going to take effort on your part, and maybe even strenuous effort. We strive, we labor to look for peace. And unless we don't strenuously work and labor for peace, we're not going to find it. We're not going to retain it. Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the what? the sons of God. Who are we in this context? We're the sons of God. And as sons, we're being disciplined, and our part of our response is to strive for both peace and holiness. Romans 12 and verse 18, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And now, put this in the context of the first century and what we're seeing here. This group of individuals who is suffering violence because of their faith in Jesus, right? Persecution and oppression because of their faith in Jesus. And it would be so desirable for them to escape that conflict, that oppression, the confrontation with neighbors, the confrontation with the civic authorities. That would be desirable, but it was almost impossible for them. And it's not their own making. It's not their own making. But here is this external opposition that they're suffering. And when we suffer external opposition, that tends to make us as a people turn inward and think, look what I'm losing, look how I'm hurting, it's all about me. And so it would be important to shake them out of that mindset and say, no, you strive for peace. You look out for others first. For others first. Pursue peace with everyone. But not just peace, we have to pursue holiness as well. Holiness is to be our pursuit as well. And holiness, we learn in verse 11, that is the intended result, the intended purpose of God's discipline and God's training for us. Can you imagine not pursuing holiness, and you're going through all of this suffering and you're going through all of this discipline, and the intended result is to bear fruit, the fruit of righteousness, and you don't bear any at all. And all of a sudden the suffering and the discipline is for nothing. It's for nothing. And so we are to strive for holiness. And in fact, going back up to verses 9 and 10, he says, besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. And so this idea of holiness, then, is equated here with eternal life. So we're pursuing holiness, and verse 14 tells us, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. And again, we can take it back to the Beatitudes as well, right? Matthew 5 and verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so we're to strive. Our response to discipline, to God's discipline, is to strive. Strive for peace, strive for holiness. And then verses 15 and 16, we're to see to it. We're to see to it. In verse 15, he says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble. And by it many become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. So we strive for peace. We strive for holiness. And that begins with the individual. But that striving for peace and holiness must extend past the individual into a group effort, into a group endeavor, if you will. And so we looked in chapter 10, especially verses 24 and 25. One of the purposes of gathering is to fulfill the command to encourage one another, to stir one another up to good works, to encourage one another. And that mutual encouragement goes right along with this. It's a necessity right along with this. We have to keep watch. And we keep watch over one another, over ourselves, yes, but also each other. So that when we see one drifting away, what do? We reach out to them, right? We do everything in our power to bring them back, to prevent that, and hopefully we can see it as it begins and not after it's already done. And so that we can encourage, and we're striving for holiness and purity in our life, and so we reach out and help them do exactly the same thing. So it becomes this group endeavor. So we keep watch. We keep watch. Again, going back to this audience, they're full of discouragement. They're full of division. And as a result, some have fallen away, have rebelled against Jesus and gone back under Moses. And so there's also disobedience as well. And all of that is a very, very clear danger of failing to obtain, or maybe a better word is falling short of God's grace. And that's what our author says here. We fall short of God's grace. And it could be, there's a possibility, the way that the original is worded, that this could be a reference to the divine help that we already read about earlier in Hebrews, that are to Christians, that are to help that to those in need. But it's more likely a reference to our final salvation. It would match with what Peter would say in 1 Peter 1 and verse 13, the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation or the revealing of Jesus Christ. And so if we fall into this trap of drifting away and we fail to obtain the grace of God, in other words, we've gotten into a situation where our discouragement and disobedience have pulled us away into full-out rebellion against God, and that's going to lead to bitterness. The absence of grace results in bitterness. Have you ever ran across someone who just quit the church and you try to talk to them? And many times they're just full of anger and hatred, blaming everybody but themselves, even sometimes blaming God himself. That bitterness is what replaces the grace when one falls away. In fact, Moses talks about this. Moses talks about this. If you go to Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 29, beginning in verse 18, this is Moses talking about, and he's warning the children of Israel. Of course, this is set up, that's these two speeches that Moses gives right before they go into the land of Canaan. And of course, Moses isn't going to be allowed to go with them, but he's giving them this message. And this is what he says. It's a warning. Verse 18. He says, "Beware lest there be among you a man or woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit. One who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be saved, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. This will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man, and the curses written in this book will settle upon him. And the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity, in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in this book of the law." And so here's what Moses is warning against. Here's this view that, okay, there are going to be those who lead themselves away. But when one leads himself away, it's very likely that others are going to follow. that others are going to be led astray as well. And specifically, he talks about seeking after false idols, but not only seeking after false idols. The application Moses is pointing to is just to be stubborn and refuse to obey God's word. And he says that the people of Israel who will bring on the whole land the covenant curses, specifically that are found in Deuteronomy 28, the previous chapter. And when that happens, there's no forgiveness that exists for them as they're in that state. The sin has consequences, not just for themselves, but for the entire covenant community. When roots grow, they grow slowly, but they don't just stay in one spot, right? They spread. They spread, and they can go very, very deep, very, very wide. And so when we have been beaten down by our discouragement, when we've been infected by our disobedience, it's going to cause trouble not only in our life, but it can affect, with those deep and wide roots, it can affect others as well. And so here's this original audience of Jewish Christians. They're trying to stay strong. They're trying to stay on point and be encouraged and to not rebel like some of their day already have. And they need to be encouraged. They need the encouragement because the author here knows that they're so close to abandoning their faith because of the pressure they're under, and that's going to cause bitterness ultimately. And that stubborn bitterness is going to cause friction within the community. And all of a sudden you have not just people falling away, but the relationship of the community breaking down. And what's that going to do to the congregation of God's people? All of a sudden the support is gone. And so it becomes very, very vital. If just one member of the congregation surrenders in this struggle against sin, the likelihood is it's going to have a ripple effect and defile and maybe even devastate others in the community, because that rebellion is like a cancer that just spreads. And so there's a huge, huge warning here. So we have to make sure that we don't fail to obtain God's grace, because when we do, the result, bitterness leaks in, and we become bitter. And he gives us an example in verses 16 and 17. He gives us the example of Esau. He gives us the example of Esau. Genesis doesn't remember Esau as a sexually immoral person, specifically, unless they're talking about his marriage to the woman outside of the covenant family. That could be what he's referring to here. But it may not be specifically in mind, it may not be specifically fornication that he's talking about, because spiritual adultery is also an image that could be used here. And Esau would definitely be guilty of that. So it may be a euphemism for his unfaithfulness. But the unholy here really clarifies the author's point. Esau is shown here as having a very worldly mindset. He's not worried about spiritual things. And what is it that Esau was so hungry for? You remember the story, right? Comes in from hunting, and what does he smell?
His brother's pottage.
Yeah.
Stew.
Some stew is being cooked, right? And so what does he give up? His birthright. He gives up his birthright. I mean, just think about that. He gives up his birthright for Dinty Moore. You know, it's just not worth it, right? What happens to food? As hungry as we are, we eat it. It leaves us, and we're hungry again. It's temporary. Temporary. But that birthright, that would have followed him and his next generation and the next generation and the next generation. We would say it's a very, very poor choice that he made, right? And so that's the picture for these first century Christians, and by extension for us. We have to have our minds set on spiritual things. Because the worldly things and even the worldly pain that we suffer, the things that aren't fair that we go through, all of those things are temporary. And he compares these Christians who have already given up. He's pointing to them and he says they're just like Esau. They're giving up an eternal inheritance for something that is just simply temporary. Whether it be the pleasure of sin to go off into, or whether it just be too tired to go on and giving up. And so we make that same connection. We make that same connection. He was giving up something that was valuable and lasting for something that was fleeting. And unfortunately, his immaturity in doing so, his not ignorance, his irresponsibility in doing so, it really yes.
His mother was in on that deal too.
Well, later on, Jacob would be, because that's when he puts on and tricks Isaac, you know. But here's Esau's immaturity, his folly, if you will. He points to that to reinforce what he's previously said in chapter 10. And again, he's pulling these things together. When he says, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. He also warns in verse 27 of chapter 10 that continuous sin and rebellious sin will only leave us fearful, in a fearful expectation of judgment. A fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. And so here's our response to God's discipline. It's not easy necessarily. But if we have the right mindset and understand the purpose, that is to produce fruit in our lives and make us endure the hardships that are coming. And so that when we struggle against suffering and we struggle against sin and we're struggling to the point of exhaustion, we can dig deep and find that endurance. So we don't give up our eternal inheritance for something that's just absolutely fleeting. Okay. Any questions or comments on any of this? It's a lot. Hebrews is a lot. Okay. All right. We're just about out of time. Donald, do you want to lead us in a closing prayer? Would you mind? And they can be dismissed. Everybody, go ahead and stand up if you can.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we had to come together and once again study another portion of your word. Help us to take the thoughts that have been presented and apply them to our lives and become better Christians in the future. We pray for all those names that have been lifted up to you tonight, those that are sick, especially those, Jack and his family, their hour of bereavement. Comfort them as only you can. Be with us as we press on, strengthen our faith, and save us in